Welcome to the shop course on welding fundamentals and key terms. Have you ever been confused by welder talk? Well, if so, you're not alone. The combination of technical terms and slang can be quite confusing, and there's a ton of misinformation out there. Well, we're going to fix that right now so you'll know what everyone's talking about. So let's start at the ground level. What is welding? And don't laugh, because my experience tells me not to take anything for granted. I've heard lots of people describe things that, well, aren't welding. Welding technically describes a fusion process where base materials, or base metals in this case, are melted together. This can be done with or without the addition of filler metal to the joint. A weld made without filler metal is referred to as an autogenous weld. And the combination of base metal and filler metal in the new weld area is called an admixture. Soldering and brazing are joining processes where the base materials don't melt. Only the filler metal or the filler alloy melts. There is no coalescence of materials, and thus soldering and brazing technically are not welding. Now, what's the difference between soldering and brazing? Technically, they both look the same, both can be done the same way. They just have differences in the melting temperature or the activation temperature at which the solder or braze material begins to flow or wet out. If a process is done at or below 400 degrees Celsius, it's referred to as soldering. And if a process takes place above 400 degrees Celsius, it's referred to as brazing. Now, in the old days, people incorrectly referred to brazing as silver soldering because a lot of the filler metals used had high amounts of silver in them. Today, if we hear the word silver solder, it typically means a lead-free solder that's used to solder copper pipes, and it doesn't refer to brazing at all. So if you're talking to a plumber and they say to silver solder something, they're talking about a soft solder or a low-temperature lead-free solder that's safe to use with drinking water. On the other hand, if you're talking to a shop hand that's been around for a while and they say to silver solder something, they may intend for you to actually braze it. So now that you know the difference between soft silver solder and hard silver solder or brazing, when you hear that term, you'll be just as confused as I am, and you'll have to ask for more details. Now, have you ever heard of braze-welding? It seems contradictory. How can something be brazing and be welding at the same time? Well, when we look at traditional soldering and brazing, they require close-fitting, intimate surface contact and often with overlapping joints to achieve necessary strength. In those cases, a force called capillary action or capillary attraction actually pulls the filler metal into the joint so that it fills that area completely and achieves full strength. In a case of braze welding, this process looks like welding, but we use a low-temperature filler metal, and the operator actually places the filler rod right in the joint where the weld is supposed to occur. There still should be no base metal melting, but it looks a lot more like traditional welding processes, and capillary action is not involved. And as you can imagine, this type of welding or braze welding requires special filler metals, and normally brass or bronze are preferred in the case of steel base metals. So why not just weld everything? Why would we use soldering or brazing if they're probably not as strong as a true weld? Well, there's a few different reasons for that. Some metals are very, very difficult to weld, either because they have extremely high thermal conductivity and require a lot of power, and other materials actually can't be welded together. So if we're working with steel and aluminum, for example, or steel and copper, we can't fusion weld those together with traditional arc welding processes, so it's best to use soldering, brazing, or braze welding in order to do that. In the case of a material like cast iron, it just has darn right low weldability or poor weldability, meaning it takes a lot of preparation and post-weld heat treatment in order to prevent cast iron from cracking. So if we can use brazing or braze welding to repair a cast iron, we don't have to deal with such a high tendency for cracking.